Hello, and thank you for joining me. Coming up in the news, a very popular general aviation aircraft now has a jet fuel version. There's an alternative bill to ATC privatization that's just been introduced in the House of Representatives. And a GA aircraft in Florida encounters a gator. Plus, additional information about magnetos and how to do a shutdown mag check correctly. Some alternative ADS-B solutions that our listeners are considering installing in their aircraft, plus the largest batch of listener questions and emails we've ever had. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott, and I'm here to share my over 40 years of experience as a licensed pilot, author, and 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year to bring you news and safety tips to help you fly safely. And just a quick reminder, the 2017 Listener Survey is live, and later I'll tell you about a change I've already made to the website based on the survey input. So if you have ideas on how you'd like to see this show improved, or if you just want to say, keep it the way it is, please take a few minutes to take the survey. Go to aviationnewstalk.com/survey, or you can get to it by clicking a link in the show notes. I'll plan to keep the survey open through the end of June. By the way, about 15% of survey respondents said they learned of the show through a friend. So if you enjoy the show, please tell your friends. All this and more, and the news starts now. Well, almost every pilot has heard of the Cessna 172, but did you know there's a jet fuel version available now? From Flying Magazine, after more than 5 years in development, the FAA and EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, have certified the Cessna Turbo Skyhawk JTA, which is the jet fuel version of the 172, with next-generation Garmin G1000 NXI avionics. We talked about those a while back. That's the new version of the G1000 with a processor that runs 10 times as fast. They say that deliveries are going to start soon in the United States and Europe, and this new model is equipped with a Continental CD-155 turbo diesel engine, and they say it's exceeded their initial performance targets, including improved maximum range. And you are not going to believe the range. Final performance figures, 963 nautical miles of range. That's about 50% more than the gasoline-powered version of the Skyhawk. Now, they don't mention what the fuel consumption is, but typically engines of this type burn around 6 gallons per hour. Other figures, takeoff distance of 1,300 feet, maximum climb rate of 767 feet per minute, and max speed of 134 knots, which sounds to me about maybe 10 knots faster than a 172. Now, the 155 horsepower turbo diesel includes direct fuel injection and dual FADEC, so that's electronic ignition controlled by a single power lever, and it sells for, well, no surprise, $450,000. So I'm guessing not too many individuals will run out and buy these, but I bet you're going to find these in flight schools because it's going to be a lot more cost effective to operate an aircraft that burns maybe 5 or 6 gallons per hour. From AINonline.com, Saturday's Beechjet Flameout marks the 5th in its type. A Beechjet 400A operated by a travel management company diverted and safely landed at Buffalo Airport in New York after experiencing a left engine flameout over northwestern Pennsylvania while cruising at flight level 390. According to the FAA and FlightAware, this is the 5th in-flight engine flameout involving a Beechjet, including 3 dual flameouts of this type. The flight departed from Louisville, Kentucky, and was en route to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey with actress Jennifer Lawrence on board. The FAA said the Beechjet landed in Buffalo at about 1:40 p.m. They said the crew diverted to Buffalo when they declared an emergency due to engine-related issues. According to their CEO, Scott Weiss, and VP of Operations Chip Schultz, the left engine flamed out at cruising altitude, and the pilots made 2 in-air restart attempts before diverting to Buffalo. The right engine never quit, and it was a textbook single-engine landing. Following 4 previous Beechjet flameout incidents, the NTSB issued an urgent recommendation in August 2006 due to the possibility of compressor surge after ingesting ice crystals at high altitude. They said, quote, Beechjet 400 pilots should activate ignition and anti-ice systems at high altitude whenever they are in or near visible moisture or convective storm activity, or before any power reduction occurs in those conditions. And as it has been most weeks, privatization is back in the news. But we finally had the two sides shaping up as to what the alternatives may be. Last week, the administration started the week by touting ATC privatization as the cornerstone of their plan to upgrade infrastructure in the United States. But later in the week, an alternative bill was introduced. And this comes from, govexec.com. It says H.R. 2800, the Aviation Funding Stability Act of 2017, was introduced. The proposed legislation aims to strengthen and speed up the reforms taking place at the FAA and its air traffic control system through the Next Gen initiative. A spokesman said, by providing certainty to the FAA's funding stream and boosting reforms to the FAA's personnel and procurement systems, this bill presents an opportunity to accelerate modernization of the FAA, which is something I think folks on both sides of the aisle can get behind. Went on to say, if we truly want to fix the real problems facing the FAA today, the solution is simple. Congress can and should pass targeted reforms. So I think the two sides are shaping up. We're going to talk a lot more in detail about privatization in the future as more details become known on both sides. From Alaska, this comes to us from khns.org, which I believe is a public radio station in Haines, Alaska. NTSB says pilot shut off one engine before a fatal plane crash near Haines. The surviving passenger of a fatal crash told investigators that the pilot purposely stopped one engine to demonstrate how to restart it in flight. That's one detail in a preliminary report released by the NTSB this week. The crash killed two people and injured another. Now, the three were flying a twin-engine Piper PA-30 Twin Comanche from Juneau to Haines to attend the Haines Beer Fest. But at about 11 a.m., about 10 miles away, something went wrong. The plane went down on a rocky beach near the Glacier Point airstrip. An NTSB investigator said, unfortunately, it does sound like one engine, the right engine, was shut down intentionally, and they were unable to restart it, which ultimately led to the accident. According to the report, which summarizes about 20 minutes into the flight, the pilot intentionally shut down the right engine to demonstrate how to restart it, but it didn't work. It's my understanding that they tried to restart it using the battery power, but they were unable to restart it. They then tried to air start it, which means they climbed to an altitude and dove the airplane to try and get the airspeed up to be able to windmill the prop. Unfortunately, that did not work as well. The report says that after multiple failed attempts to restart the engine, the pilot decided to land at Glacier Point Gravel Airstrip. The surviving passenger told the NTSB the passenger wanted to use a battery booster to start the right engine. Before landing, the pilot made a low-level pass. The report says a witness saw the plane reach the end of the airstrip, descend, turn right, and then crash into the shoreline. The witness said the plane hit the shore at a right wing down, nose down angle. NTSB recovered the wrecked plane and said the damage is consistent with that angle of impact. The reason I wanted to talk about this story is just to tell you I don't think it makes sense to shut down an engine for demonstration purposes under most any circumstance. You can certainly simulate a shutdown engine in all kinds of ways. If you're going to actually turn it off, though, I highly advise that you be at altitude and be within gliding distance of an airport where you can land. From AOPA, good news for pilots with cataracts. In July 2016, the FDA approved the Tecnis Symphony intraocular lens, a new type of lens that allows the eye to focus on objects both near and far, according to Abbott, the company that produces the lens. In addition to correcting cataracts by replacing clouded lenses, the Tecnis Symphony also corrects other vision problems. AOPA member David Klein reported across-the-board improvement in his vision following lens replacement, including near and distant vision in all light conditions, day and night. He wrote that the lens replacements have allowed him to dispense with contact lenses for the first time in his adult life. Typically, the approval process for this type of device takes at least a year, but AOPA learned that FAA doctors are enthusiastic about the lens, and it was quickly approved. Aviation medical examiners are empowered to issue medical certificates at the time of exam to pilots whose cataracts have been corrected with the Abbott lens. Pilots should get a report on the lens replacement procedure and its effect from the eye surgeon, present it to their AME, and that should allow the examiner to issue a medical without needing further FAA review. In international news, let's talk briefly about the Paris Air Show, not strictly a general aviation event, but one of worldwide interest. It's really a large commercial event, its major purpose being to demonstrate military and civilian aircraft to potential customers. And according to the aviationist.com, earlier this month, the F-35 was videotaped rehearsing its new flight demonstration routine in Texas for preparation for the show. Now, that website previously reported that restrictions for aerobatics imposed on the F-35 back in 2016 have most likely been relaxed or lifted. So the show was originally started in 1909. It's held every 2 years. In 2015, the last time the show was held, they had 350,000 visitors. Some of the other aircraft expected to fly would be aircraft from Airbus and Dassault, the Rafale fighter. The Textron Scorpion two-seat military jet is likely to fly, along with some historic aircraft like the Curtiss P-40, the P-51. Now, the Russians have missed previous air shows because of problems with their visas, but they will probably be there this year, according to Russian publication Sputnik. Russian companies will showcase a range of military and civilian products, including the Antonov AN-178. Now, we talked about the show at length on Airplane Geeks this week, so if you want to know more about the Paris show, check out airplanegeeks.com, episode 456. And in experimental and LSA news, Lancair brings back the four-place fixed-gear Mako as a competitor to the Cirrus SR-22 and Cessna TTX. This comes to us from flyingmagazine.com. Now, the Mako is closely related to the TTX, which started out as the Columbia 350-400. And in fact, I believe that those two aircraft were designed by the same person. I think the gentleman left Lancair to design the Columbia 400, as I recall. Anyway, the Mako is powered by a Lycoming IO 540 engine. Its cruise speed is expected to reach about 205 knots. The turbocharged version will be significantly faster, topping out around 256 knots. Takeoff distance is expected to be as low as 600 feet, with a climb rate of, get this, more than 2,000 feet per minute. A precision induction system will keep the fuel burn lower than similarly powered airplanes, as low as 13.5 gallons for normally aspirated versions versus about 19 gallons for the turbo version. Now, the Mako has an impressive load capability, boasting a useful load of 1,300 pounds. It has 4 seats and a rear baggage compartment capable of holding 175 pounds a gear. Lancair also says they're going to offer a quick build program for the Mako, which is expected to run about 4 weeks. From aeromarine-lsa.com, speaking of quick build programs, a quick build kit for the Merlin PSA or personal sport aircraft has been approved. If you're not familiar with the Merlin, well, you're not the only one. It's brand new. It's a single-seat, all-metal aircraft powered by a 4-stroke HKS or a 2-stroke Rotax 582 engine. Now, Aeromarine President Chip Irwin from his build center in Florida says the builder actually builds his own airplane, and you're ready to fly, not just taxi, in 2 weeks. Now, that's pretty fast. After the first week, the airframe is finished and builders are on to the engine and panel installations. Initial performance from flight tests in the UK show that they reached 97 miles an hour at 5,350 RPM with the Rotax 582 installed. So from that, they extrapolate a possible normal cruise at altitude with 5,600 RPM of likely around 110 miles an hour. Now, the Merlin PSA quick build kits are available for delivery this summer, and some slots remain open for the Builders Center as well. The kit without engine, prop, and paint has an introductory price of only $16,500, and depending on engine and panel options, completed and painted aircraft cost from $30,000 to $45,000. Several Merlin PSA are already flying in the UK, and several more are nearing completion in the US. Finally, in News of the Weird, though this happens more often than you might think, last week a Piper Navajo landed on runway 725 at Orlando Executive Airport and struck an alligator. The Piston twins suffered damage to the wing, according to Brad Pierce, a pilot who posted information about the accident on Facebook. The 11-foot alligator was killed. While rare, alligator strikes are not a new occurrence. Now, this really surprised me. The FAA's wildlife strike database includes 19 reports of alligator aircraft incidents since 1990. In only one of those cases did the aircraft operator report damage resulting from the collision. Now, among terrestrial animals, the creature most commonly struck by aircraft is the white-tailed deer, for which over 1,000 strikes were reported since 1990. Incidentally, I nearly hit a deer on one of my first flights after I got my private license in Pennsylvania back in the 1970s. Not surprisingly, the overwhelming majority of wildlife strikes incidents are with birds, over 164,000 collisions noted over the same time period. And that story comes to us from WFTV.com and AvWeb. That's the news for this week. Coming up in a moment, we talk more about magnetos how to do a proper mag check before you shut down the engine, plus some listener letters. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Before we talk about magneto checks and then ADSB, I want to thank everyone who has taken the survey so far and to let you know that I'm already acting on some of your recommendations. So, for example, over the weekend, I did change the link to the pilotlearning.com website to SSL, the Secure Sockets Layer, which is the standard security technology for encrypting the links between a server and a client. So those of you who go to our aviationnewstalk.com website, that's not SSL, but then, of course, you're not entering any personal information there. But if you click on online courses, that will take you to an HTTPS or SSL connection to pilotlearning.com. So thank you to the person who made that suggestion. Also, I noted that about 20% of the listeners are student pilots, which surprised me. So I wanted to offer you a free download, which is my Learn to Fly ebook. You just go out to maxtrescott.com, and over in the right-hand column, you'll see a link to my free Learn to Fly ebook. Just go ahead and click that. Has a picture of a Cirrus on the cover there, because believe it or not, I do teach some student pilots in the Cirrus. And of course, if you haven't taken the survey yet, go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. Also, I plan to have a show on Basic Med coming up. So tell me what experiences you've had, either good, bad, or indifferent, with Basic Med. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/contact and send me an email. Now, this is the part of the show where I talk briefly about 3 ways you can support the show. The most important way, and I know this is working, tell your aviation friends about the show. The next way is to leave a review on iTunes, and we'll read a couple of those reviews later. And the third way, if you don't want to find yourself up there in the clouds wondering which buttons to push, sign up for one of my online courses at pilotlearning.com. We have courses for the G1000, both for VFR and IFR operations, and there's a GPS and WAAS course for those of you flying the latest fancy GPS approaches using WAAS, such as LPV and LNAV plus V. Course costs range from $59 to $79, or you can take all the courses for a low monthly membership of $29.95, or sign up for an entire year for $299, which is the same as getting 2 free months. And if you sign up for the full year, you'll get a half-hour consulting call with me on any topic you'd like to discuss. Let's get to magnetos. So a lot of great feedback from people on episode 13, where we talked about hot props and safety around magnetos. Also, 2 people let me know that I had forgotten something which I had planned to include. So I want to thank both Ken and Bill for reminding me to talk about the Shutdown Mag Check, which I had meant to talk about. Ken wrote on the Airplane Geek Slack team, has anyone listened to Max Trescott's latest podcast on mag checks and hot props? If not, stop what you're doing right now and take a listen. At a minimum, listen before your next flight. By far the best and most detailed explanation I've ever heard. He goes on, what scared me is regardless how I shut down the airplane, what really matters is how the guy before me shut it down. Really good point, Ken. He says, I guess I never really fully took that into account. Amazing I still have fingers left. The bottom line is, Max Trescott, you did well. I'm sure you've saved a couple of lives out there. I've already arranged to have the podcast played at 2 of my next Flying Club meetings. He goes on to say, Max, you didn't address the both mags off, see if the engine still runs check. I've heard that one go both ways. Some people say it's a good thing to check the P-lead. Others say don't do it. Sounds like from your podcast, the engine will keep running regardless because of the fuel in the cylinder. And let me give a shout out to the Mid-Island Pilots Club, which meets in Ronkonkoma, New York on Long Island. That's where Ken was playing episode 13, the Magneto section this week to that group. Now, I also had an email from Bill who wrote, your podcast is rapidly becoming my favorite aviation podcast, mostly due to great content, but also your discipline to keeping it to 30 minutes. That fits my morning exercise routine. Thanks for the Magneto update. A couple of quick questions. I've heard people recommend a grounding check before shutdown by momentarily turning both mags off at idle power and then back on, followed by normal mixture shutdown. Does this check anything that a normal mag check in the run-up doesn't do? Maybe it just ensures that they're still grounded at the end of the flight before you touch the prop. He also had said, part 2, you mentioned electronic ignition systems. I assume a complete electrical failure will cause these to stop working. So is the requirement to have one traditional magneto with an electronic ignition system? So let me talk about 2 things that I meant to talk about, and that'll answer Bill's first question, then I'll come back to his second question about electronic ignition. So let's talk first about in-flight problems. If you're flying along and your engine becomes rough during flight, it could be because one magneto has developed a timing problem. If that happens to you, you want to switch to both the L and the R positions to see if the engine will run better in one of those positions. And if it does, just leave the magneto switches or the key in that position for the rest of the flight and report the problem to your mechanic. Now, normally we would fly on the both position, but if necessary, try the L and the R to see if things work better. Now, for the shutdown mag check, some checklists say to switch the mag switches or the key very briefly to the off position so that you can hear if the engine is stopping. And if it is, that verifies that both magnetos are properly grounded. Then, before the engine quits altogether, quickly switch back to the both position and shut down the engine properly by pulling the mixture to idle. If there's a mag key, it's important that you do this check by turning all the way to the off position and not just turning to the L and the R positions as some CFIs insist. See, if you turn to the L and the R positions, you're checking part of the grounding system, but you are not checking whether the switch itself works in the off position. And it's not unusual for an older switch to become corroded and fail to work in one position. So definitely do that shutdown mag check by switching briefly to the off position and not just to the L and the R positions. If you do the mag checks and the engine shut down properly, you will greatly enhance your safety when you move a prop. Now back to Bill's second question about electronic ignition systems and whether a complete electrical failure will cause the engine to stop. The answer is yes. In fact, a complete electrical failure did occur in Germany in a Diamond at DA42, and boy, those engines will stop quickly when you lose all electricity. He said, therefore, do you need a traditional magneto as a backup to an electronic ignition system? And the answer is no, there is no such requirement. Instead, there's always a backup battery which is dedicated to the ECU, the electronic control unit, so that even if your main battery dies, the ECU will still work and keep the engine running. Also, planes mostly have redundant ECUs. I don't think I've ever seen one with a single ECU. So if one ECU fails, the other one automatically takes over. If your main battery fails, then the backup batteries take over. Obviously, it's pretty important to keep electricity going to those systems. Okay, let's change gears now and talk about ADSB. I had a couple of emails from listeners this week about that, so I thought I would share some of those with you. Rob writes from New York, Dear Max, I'm a big fan and have both your books and enjoy the podcast. Well, thanks for that, Rob. I'm trying to figure out the ADSB upgrade. I have a 2010 Cessna 172S equipped with a G1000. It's WAS certified. I also fly with a Stratus 2 portable ADSB receiver connected to ForeFlight on my iPad and have Sirius Weather subscription, so that's Sirius XM Weather. I have two options to comply with the 2020 ADSB out requirement. One, I can upgrade the transponder from the GTX33 to the GTX33ES. And by the way, just as an aside, the GTX33 is a remote-mounted Mode-S transponder, so it can receive TIS-A traffic from the roughly 100 radar sites in the United States that support TIS. But the FAA plans to phase TIS out over time. Now, this GTX33 can be upgraded to the ES version, which supports ADSB out, but not ADSB in. So he says one option he has, upgrade the GTX33 to the ES version. The second option, he says, replace the current transponder with a Garmin 345, which has both ADSB in and out. He says, I think doing option one means for me to receive traffic, I will have to rely upon my Stratus 2 with a ForeFlight app on my iPad because this upgrade only provides ADSB out. I currently receive TIS traffic on the G1000, but I think, and please verify, that this is only TIS-A based on the Mode-S transponder. Yes, it is. And it's sending me traffic based on the roughly 100 ground stations that require radar coverage that can see me. I will get the more accurate TIS-B on my iPad via Stratus and continue to get the less complete TIS-A on the G1000, right? And the answer to that question is yes, you are right. You will see more accurate TIS-B on your iPad. You'll see the less accurate and soon to be obsolete, well, not soon, but over a number of years, phased out TIS traffic on the G1000. It continues, if I do option 2, I think I will now get traffic coverage directly via the G1000, and this will be TIS-B traffic, no longer dependent upon the TIS-A 100 ground stations. Yes, that's true. Further, I believe this traffic information will be displayed on ForeFlight via the Bluetooth link in the Garmin 345 transponder. So basically, the only value left with the Stratus 2 is the backup AHRS data it provides. Yes, I agree with all of that. Both options also include the Garmin software upgrade to version 563.35, which I think is required to get ADS-B out. Option 1 is $6,000. Option 2 is $9,500. So it seems that basically the $3,500 difference is whether I want to see ADS-B in traffic displayed on the iPad via the Stratus 2, which would be option 1, or the more expensive $9,500 see the traffic displayed on both the iPad and the G1000. Displaying it on the G1000 is a better heads-up experience because I don't have to look down at my iPad, but with the oral warnings, not sure it's worth the extra $3,500. For this discussion, weather is not material because I have a serious weather subscription. I would keep that regardless of which upgrade option. So I emailed back to Rob in part. I think I agree with everything you wrote. I guess if you had the iPad mounted in a way that you could instantly see it, the less expensive solution would be fine. But would you still be able to see exactly how far an aircraft is? I really like the G1000 traffic page because I can instantly take away all the map clutter and easily just see the traffic and the exact distance to each target. I haven't used the iPad much for traffic, but I don't remember seeing a decluttered traffic view like what you get from the G1000's traffic page. And he wrote back, thanks so much. I think I'm going to go with option 2 and get the Garmin 330. And he wrote back, thanks so much for the response. I think I'm going to go with option 2 and get the Garmin 345 transmitter and thus both ADS-B in and out. Who knows how much longer TIS-A will be supported, and the traffic presentation is much better on the G1000. Yes, I totally agree. He says, for your question on ForeFlight, there is a high distant traffic function in the settings, and you can use it so that the app will only show airplanes that are within plus and minus 3,500 feet vertically and 15 nautical miles. But the G1000 is much better at giving me the actual distance to the target, and to get oral warnings with ForeFlight, you need to have ADS-B out installed. Yes, totally agree with that. I think the presentation is much better on the G1000. On the iPad, you still have that map background clutter. I don't think there's a way to easily just drop all that out so that you can exactly see how far each traffic is away. On the G1000, I can easily estimate my distance to traffic, probably plus and minus a half mile, so I instantly know exactly how far an aircraft is away. Now, I also had an email from Jonathan in California who brings up privacy as a major issue. He says, I had a GTX 345 installed in my plane last year and love it. The traffic display is a fantastic improvement in safety. On my way to Camarillo a few weeks ago, the ADS-B saw a plane pacing me at my altitude as I flew down Highway 101. I did not have visual contact, but I asked ATC about it, and he said he'd keep an eye on him for me. But one downside is privacy that we give up using ADS-B. FlightAware.com now has very high-resolution views of all ADS-B flights sampling every few seconds. If that was done for our cars, there would be a huge outcry, I'm sure. He says I filed a bar request. Now, that's a block aircraft registration request so that your aircraft ID is not transmitted through all these various radar tracking systems to prevent FlightAware from displaying my data, but I understand there is a crowdsourcing site out there that's gathering the data and will display it anyway. I don't think I've seen AOPA address the privacy issue of ADS-B. Thought I'd mention it to you. So I wrote back to Jonathan. I mentioned that he could turn off his transponder if he wished, but I said, just curious, what kind of issues do you envision that people would have because of the lack of privacy? He replied, I don't think there's a rule that would prohibit me from turning the transponder off, but he'd like to have it on because of the safety improvements. He says, regarding privacy, my complete trips from beginning to end are being cataloged by the government and some crowdsourced website as well. I'm just not comfortable with that. The government needs a warrant to do that on someone's automobile. A blanket tracking of all automobiles would be unthinkable. It's sad that we need to give up the freedom from surveillance just to enjoy general aviation. It's one more nail in the coffin of GA, as they say. He says, I heard a story of someone who flies to Lake Tahoe being harassed with obnoxious phone calls by some homeowner whenever their home was overflown. This is being enabled by today's FlightAware. I suppose a creative criminal could find out a way to exploit the data to burglarize houses when pilot owners are out of town. Actually, that's probably not far-fetched. Anyway, the meta issue of publicizing the comings and goings of pilots for anyone to see is the overriding issue in my mind. Thanks for listening. Keep up the good work on the podcast. And I think everyone knows there is indeed no answer that I'm aware of for the privacy issue. So basically, ADSB information is being broadcast in the clear. Anybody with a receiver could pick it up. As you mentioned, a homeowner could sit there with a receiver, track every aircraft that flew overhead. And there's really not much a pilot could do except turn off the transponder or accept the fact that all of their movements are tracked. I also had an email this week from Anoop from California, who also asked questions about upgrading his Cirrus SR-22 with ADSB, but that one gets into a lot of detail, so I think you got a good flavor from the other two of some of the issues that pilots are facing. In a moment, we'll be back with more listener questions. I'll be right back. And welcome back. We got a ton of listener email this week, but let me first thank the two people who posted iTunes reviews. David, he says, I'm generally more interested in commercial aviation than GA, but Max's knowledge and clarity in speaking about this topic has me hooked. It's all aviation, whether it's heavy metal or a Cirrus SR-22. Max makes it understandable. Thanks for that, David. And Flight 3202 says, I just installed the Garmin G5 in my RV6A, and I love it. Your podcast is great. Keep up the good work. Thanks. Well, you're very welcome. All right, let's take a look now at some listener email. First, some feedback from episode 12. This comes from Scott in Florida, and he was referring to a listener letter that I read in which 3 different pilots all flew approaches to a somewhat hard-to-reach aircraft. 2 of them ended up high and fast. One of them followed a very nice path to get to the airport. Scott points out that there's another option, which is just slowing down, and I certainly meant to imply that in episode 12. Scott writes, I enjoy your podcast. I just finished listening to the last episode and had a comment. How about a 4th option? When coming down out of 6,500 feet, slow down. He says, I fly a Citation 2, that's a Cessna, and my VREF speed is between 99 and 106 knots. My energy level is much higher since force equals mass times acceleration. Of course, he's moving faster. If I wanted to slow from 250 knots, I would never get down. Slowing down is a much easier and safer option. It only takes planning. Keep up the great work. Thanks for that, Scott. And lots of feedback from episode 14. That was last week's discussion with Joe Gepner talking about the Garmin G5, the low-cost replacement unit you can pop into an older panel. Hillel says, I've just got to find out who that avionics shop is that charges $1,000 and 1 day to install that G5. My shop will take at least 2 days and at least $1,500. And let's see, from LinkedIn, Ken from Kentucky says, listening to your podcast this morning on the way to work, great stuff. And actually, we have one of those G5 instruments in one of our rentals at the flight school. Love it and all that the instrument does. And Mark from the San Francisco Bay Area, also from LinkedIn, says, I have installed one and it is fantastic. And finally from Facebook, Ruben in Belgium says, I guess this competes directly with the Aspen units, ? Is it IFR approved? Can it show a flight director? And the answer is yes to all the above. It certainly competes with the Aspen units. It is IFR approved, and it can show a flight director. I pulled out the manual. Now, this would be just for the experimental version because the version for certificated aircraft doesn't yet have autopilot capability. But it says for the experimentals with the flight director active, the aircraft can be hand-flown to follow the path shown by the command bars. The flight director has the following maximum commands: pitch of minus 15 degrees to plus 20 degrees and roll of 30-degree angles.
Hey, this is Alan out of Denver, Colorado, and I had a quick question about flying through weather, being that this is the time of the year we're all doing it. If static accumulates to the static wick and then discharges via the pin, how does the aircraft develop a negative charge? Or how does the act of discharging create the electrical disturbance in the aircraft if it's equipped to release the negative charge?
Great question, Alan. Let me first explain how an aircraft can develop a static charge, the kind of radio interference that results in, and how static wicks can work to bleed the static electricity from the aircraft. First, whenever two objects with different electrical properties come into contact, electrons are transferred from one to the other. And you see that when you rub a kid's balloon against your hair and then the balloon will stick to the wall. Well, when an aircraft flies, Friction between the plane and the air surrounding it transfers electrons from the air to the skin of the aircraft. Now, as that electricity discharges from the aircraft, that can generate RFI or radio frequency interference, which we would mostly hear as static. Now, RFI can become serious enough to really interfere with your comm and nav radios to the point where reception's impossible. And if you have any particulate matter in the air like rain or sand or dust or snow or even volcanic ash, that's going to make the RFI even worse. RFI most often affects lower frequencies. So in an aircraft, that would be things like the ADF receiver and the VHF nav and comm radios. And about 20 years ago, I was flying IMC in a Cessna 182 when I flew into a fairly heavy storm and started picking up ice. Now, the interference got so bad that my VOR stopped working altogether. So I just told ATC that I was going to fly a certain heading, which I did for a really long time until the interference died down and the VOR started working again. Now, most aircraft have static wicks, which are long, thin, wire-like devices that are bonded to the trailing edge of the wings, the elevator, and the rudder, and they dissipate the static charge. Static wicks were, by the way, developed during World War II. And to make sure the static can freely transfer from the airplane to the wicks, you'll often see a wire braid connection from the horizontal and vertical stabilizers to the elevator and the rudder. And what I've noticed is that wire braid connection, at least on the 172s that I teach in at the Flying Club, they seem to break every year or two and need to be replaced. Now, a broken braid wire is not going to affect you if you're flying VFR, but it will make the RFI worse if you're flying in the clouds. So as part of your pre-flight check, if you're going to be flying IFR, make sure that those wire braid connections, which are really close to the bolts that attach the rudder and the elevator, are intact. And if those wires are broken, then you probably want to squawk that and probably not fly.
Good day. This is Ruben Philipsen. I'm calling in from Belgium at the moment, where I'm based as a general aviation commercial pilot flying twin-engine turboprops. Why is it that in the USA people call pilot licenses certificates? And also, why do they sometimes call pilots airmen instead of just pilots? Like, as far as I know, most countries call it pilot licenses, and there you call it airman certificates or pilot certificates, which is odd because I think you also call your driving license a driving license. Anyway, always fun to hear why these different countries have different names for the same thing. Thanks for the podcast, as always, and keep it up. I like it. Bye-bye.
Ruben, thanks for your question from Belgium or Belgique, depending upon whether you prefer German or French. So I found this information on credentialingexcellence.org, which is the Institute for Credentialing Excellence. They're a professional membership association that provides education and other resources for people working in the credentialing industry. And they differentiate certification from licenses in this way. They say a certification program is designed to test the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to perform a particular job, and upon successful passing of a certification exam, to represent a declaration of a particular individual's professional competence. And then they say licensure, which would be like getting a license, tests an individual's competence, but it is a mandatory process by which the government grants time-limited permission for that licensed individual to practice his or her profession. Now, in the U.S., once you pass your certification to become a pilot, it's good forever, unlike a license, which is time-limited and expires. So our driver licenses do have an expiration date on them. Our pilot certificates do not. So I think that's probably the primary reason there. Also, you were asking about the difference between a pilot and an airman. Well, there are two definitions for pilot. One could be a person who steers a ship and also possibly someone who steers an aircraft, whereas an airman is strictly someone who is operating an aircraft. So I think that's probably why they use airman instead of pilot. Though it's interesting that they do here in the U.S. use the name private pilot as the name of the certification that an airman gets when they pass their check ride. And here's a question from John from Lisbon, Iowa, which is in the Cedar Rapids area. Hey, Max, I love the podcast. Keep up the great work. I'm in the early stages of training for an instrument rating, having logged about 6 hours of simulated instrument time. The simulated time has been pretty easy. Last week, I flew real IMC for the first time and found it to be an entirely different experience. I frequently found myself disoriented. I often thought I was turning when I was level or vice versa. This never happened to me in simulated IMC. Are there factors that are different in real IMC that would cause this? Is this a phenomena you've experienced with any of your students? Well, I wrote back and said, great question. When I started my IFR training, which was more than 20 years ago, I had the same experience as you did. I never got comfortable in IMC until I started flying in glass cockpits where it was easy to see if I was banked a couple of degrees from straight and level. I said, I'm just curious, when you fly simulated IMC, does your hood completely eliminate your view outside? I think many hoods give you a tiny bit of peripheral vision, which makes the hood so much more comforting than flying in IMC. And I just heard back from John today, and he said, I think you might be right on. I went up for another lesson tonight and noticed I can indeed pick up the outside in my peripheral vision with the glasses on. It's not something I noticed before, but I wouldn't be surprised if my body is subconsciously using it. Fascinating. He mentions the type of hood he's using. He says I might have to see if I can modify them or shop around for something that can make the simulated time more realistic. Thanks for the advice. Much appreciated. And here's a question that came in over Twitter. Chris says, Max Truscott, your aviation news talk is great. Any advice for a renter that flies 4 different airplanes? A 7ECA, that's a Citabria, a VFR 172F, an IFR 172M, and an Aero. I wrote back to get some more information from him, and he said, I was a rusty pilot. I flew 75 hours last year, 400 hours total time. The goal is to become a part-time CFI and fly the 172 regularly. I'm just starting the commercial in the Aero and finishing tailwheel in the Citabria. Well, so what I said to him is first 75 hours a year, that's a pretty good amount. Most pilots don't fly that much. And so I think it is realistic to be able to fly 4 different airplanes if you're flying that much. Now, if he'd come back to me and said, I fly 25 hours a year, I would have said, man, I think you should really concentrate those hours in just 1 or maybe 2 airplanes that are similar. But that's just not enough time to be changing a lot of airplanes. But 75 hours a year, you can pull that off. So my recommendation was, for sure, be religious about using your checklist, because that's going to help you with all the differences as you go from one airplane to the other. Also said that he might want to take a look at the sight picture out the window just before every takeoff. And that way it's going to help you with the landing. If you kind of visualize, okay, what does this aircraft look like as I'm taking off? That's going to be pretty darn close to what it's going to look like when you're landing. So when you land, just remember what it looked like before you took off. Now in the Citabria, that's a tail wheel. You'll have to wait till you actually add power and are going down the runway to get a view for what that's going to look like. Now the other reason, Chris, this is going to work well is that the 2 172s you're talking about, those are pretty darn similar. The 172F and the 172M, that really makes it easy. So in my mind, you're really only flying 3 different airplanes. And I've actually got 3 more questions to answer here, but we're running out of time, so I'll roll those over for next week. That's going to wrap up the show. If you can, take a moment to give me feedback through the listener survey. You can find it at aviationnewstalk.com/survey, or if you're using an iPhone or iPad, just click on the logo for this show at the top of your screen, and you'll find a link to the survey. You'll also find links there where you can record a listener question or send me an email. And if you're thinking of buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me early in the process so I can help you with that evaluation. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. And if you've enjoyed this show, please tell your friends. And if you really like it, just leave a review in the Apple Podcast app or sign up for one of my courses at pilotlearning.com. In the meantime, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. Hello, and thank you for joining me. Coming up on the news, a very popular general aviation aircraft now has a jet fuel version. An alternative build to ATC privatization /survey, or if you're using an iPhone or iPad, just click on the logo for this